Ani, oh, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Ani Buzu, it's a good day. Welcome to today's webinar titled Indigenous Leaders on the Forefront of Co-Management and Co-Stewardship. I'm Dawn Knickerbocker. I belong to the Anishnaabe people from White Earth Nation, and I'm the Vice President of Philanthropic Strategies for the National Congress of American Indians Foundation. It's my honor to serve as your moderator today. Our collective presence today signifies a powerful commitment to not only honor, but actively engage with Indigenous perspectives and leadership in environmental stewardship. Let's embark on this journey together with open minds and a shared vision for a more inclusive and sustainable future. Today's webinar convenes a panel of esteemed leaders and scholars who are at the forefront of advocating for and implementing models of co-management and co-stewardship of lands and resources. These models not only recognize, but actively incorporate Indigenous knowledge, leadership, and our rights as sovereign tribal citizens. Our panelists today include Larry Wright Jr. of the Ponca tribe, serving as the Executive Director of the National Congress of American Indians. Lisa Wilson, Tribal Council member of the Lummi Nation. Edward Ornstein, representing the Southeastern Mvskoke Nation and serving as Special Counsel to the Mvskoke tribe of Indians of Florida. And Pat Rogers Gonzales, a distinguished professor at Yale University. Together, we will explore co-management and co-stewardship agreements, reflecting on how these frameworks can lead to a more sustainable, equitable, and respectful management of natural resources. We will also hear from the president of the NCAI Foundation, Greg Maston, URAC. And before we begin, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping notes to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. First, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available for those who wish to revisit the discussion or share it with colleagues. We encourage active participation, so please use the Q&A feature to send in questions as they arise. We're committed to maintaining our respectful and engaging forum today, so please keep your comments and questions constructive and relevant to the topic at hand. And finally, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat feature to notify the team, and we'll assist you as quickly as possible. So before we delve into our enriching discussion, I would like to introduce Greg Maston of URAC Tribe, president of the NCAI Foundation and co-chair of the Priorities, Projects, and Campaigns Committee for the America the Beautiful for All Coalition. Greg will provide us with an insightful introduction that underscores this critical gathering. Greg?
Thank you, Don, and Ayikui to everyone out there, friends and relatives. I'm really excited for this webinar today. It's the first of its kind with this coalition, and I've been a part of the America the Beautiful for All coalition since its starting days. And the coalition, really, for those of you that maybe aren't as familiar with it, it really works through the Justice 40 lens, and it's about bringing our diverse organizations together that are working to with underserved communities. Many of these communities are on the front lines of these impacts to our environment. And so this coalition, it's really focused on how can our collective voices advance the goals of 30 by 30 to protect our lands and our waterways and our oceans, the species and the plant life that we all share. And so we've done a lot of work focused on policy recommendations. And you can go to the website and you can download that and look at the recommendations that were made last year. We have another report that's coming out at the end of this month that will kind of update and look at some of the wins from the previous year, but also some new recommendations. And we're continuing to look at how we can grow this coalition to advocate for our communities. So we've done some fly-ins. We have this education series that we're doing. We are looking at other policies and cross-cutting issues. And we also are planning a conference in the upcoming year. So we're really looking at better ways that we can support our diverse voices out there of this coalition that historically have not been heard. And for me, that's really the strength of this coalition, is how we can bring together our diverse communities and look at where we can align our efforts. So with that, so my role as the NCAI Foundation president, and actually my whole body of work has always really been about acknowledging and understanding our Native peoples and our tribal nations, and beyond just acknowledging them, but how can we truly work with them and partner together in the best way possible. And so for the 30 by 30 initiative, there's a lot of alignment with tribes and how they look at this work. But the thing with 30 by 30 is that if you're not, we can't accomplish that if we're not working with tribes. So it's vitally important to understand them and how they approach this work. That's really what today's webinar is about. You're going to hear, I think, some views on, as Native people, how we do hold a sacred trust to the land, to the water, and to our wildlife. You're going to hear, as a tribal government, we have tribal government leaders here, their perspective on how they have to navigate with the federal government, with state government, sometimes county governments, and how they work to advance their work. And my hope is that whether you're working with the tribe or not, you'll at least gain a better understanding of their views on co-management and co-stewardship, and then gain some insights on what this work looks like for them on the ground. What are some of the policies that we need to pay attention to? And ultimately, how can we work together, for the betterment of us all? So we have an amazing panel today. I'm really grateful to each and every one of you for being here today to share your experiences. And I thank everybody out there in virtual land for your time today. It'll be about a 75-minute session. And I truly believe it's going to be insightful and enriching for us all. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm going to turn it back to Dawn.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm going to do a quick round robin and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Larry.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Larry Wright, Jr. I'm the Executive Director for the National Congress of American Indians. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today. Great.
And Lisa?
Asiem Nestela Chasiem Kwashilosia Sunnasnat, Lisa Wilson Sunnasnat. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Wilson. I am the Secretary for the Lummi Indian Business Council. I also serve as Vice Chair of the Northwest Indian Fish Commission. It's great to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Edward.
Shango. My name is Edward Ornstein. I serve as Special Counsel on Environmental Affairs for the Mvskoke Tribe of Indians of Florida and America's Everglades. I also serve as co-chair of the Indigenous Law Committee within the American Bar Association section on the environment, energy, and resources. I was born to the Wind Clan, and I'm an enrolled member of the Southeastern Mvskoke Nation, a state-recognized tribe in Alabama. Thank you all for having me.
Great. And Pat? You are muted, Pat.
Talofa, Pat Gonzales-Rogers. I'm currently on faculty at the Yale School of Environment, and was formerly the executive director of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition.
So our first question to our panelists, we're going to start with Larry. And the question for you, Larry, is can you discuss tribal sovereignty and how it relates to co-management and co-stewardship? And what is NCAI's approach to co-management and co-stewardship with the administration and government agencies?
You bet. Thanks. Thank you for the question, Dawn. I kind of need to back up a little bit. Before I became chairman of my tribe, I served as tribal chairman for 11 years, and now the executive director of NCAI. I'm a recovering social studies teacher as well, and And that part of me thinks it's very important that we start by making sure we define some of the terms we're talking about and setting up some of the history that has gotten us to this topic, a conversation. Your question began by asking about the role of tribal sovereignty in this space. And while it may seem a little basic, I think it's worth taking a moment to talk about sovereignty generally and tribal sovereignty more specifically. You know, if we talk about sovereignty, you know, it's often defined as power or authority, or sometimes the ability to self-govern. And oftentimes these definitions paint sovereignty as a black or white concept. And either you have sovereignty or you don't. But we know that the reality is a little different than that. And especially here in the United States in particular, there are many different sovereigns acting at different times. And the Constitution explicitly recognizes three sovereigns: the federal government, state governments, and tribal governments. And with these three different sovereigns acting with the United States, and of course, there are subdivision of those sovereigns as well, such as counties, cities, school board districts, water districts, and many others. Each of these different sovereigns have authority and rights over different individuals, different land bases, different policy areas, and at least within the United States, the odds are that multiple sovereigns have some amount of power and authority over us as an individual, no matter what we're doing or who you are. And I think it's helpful to understand that the United States is comprised of these multiple sovereigns, and that sovereignty can have areas of overlap when you're thinking about concepts such as co-management and co-stewardship. And, you know, if you look at federal law for a definition of co-management or co-stewardship, you aren't likely to find a single specific definition, which means the term gets used in different ways by different people. And I think for the most part, and I think for our discussion today, co-management can be understood to be an agreement between two sovereigns, in this case, the United States and a tribal nation, seeking to cooperate in some fashion, typically with respect to land, water, or some other resource. And when we talk about co-management of federal lands, is different from other management partnerships due in part to federally recognized tribes' unique government-to-government relationship with the federal government. And the rise of co-management and co-stewardship agreements is a consequence of the fact that many of today's federal lands are located on or near tribal ancestral homelands and are often close to current tribal lands within reservation boundaries. And because many tribal nations maintain ongoing physical, cultural, spiritual, and economic relationships with their ancestral homelands, there's a desire by tribal nations to be able to exercise as much control over those lands as possible. And thus, while co-management and co-stewardship agreements do not offer tribal nations the same amount of power or authority as they have over territory within their sovereign boundaries, both of these agreements are an extension of tribal sovereignty because they allow tribal nations to exercise more power and control than they otherwise would have without those agreements. And so I'm with that history lesson, and that is largely the lens through which NCI approaches these types of agreements. NCI was founded to defend tribal sovereignty and to further its exercise. Understanding co-management and co-stewardship agreements as expansions of tribal sovereignty mean, perhaps unsurprisingly, to NCI's position in support of more co-management, more co-stewardship agreements across Indian country, particularly as they relate to sacred sites, subsistence hunting and fishing territories, and the protection of natural resources.
Fantastic. I want to thank you for giving us this context. And with that, we're going to dive into some specifics. Lisa, you're up first. What is the Lummi Nation's position on co-management and co-stewardship? And how does this impact how your tribe works with the federal, state, and county governments on these projects?
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah, so we definitely, it is pretty complex because we have definitely different levels of governments, you know, and I do like to start with, the city of Bellingham and Whatcom County. We have what's called a WIRA 1 group that actually works within the watershed. And so we do have co-management agreements that, we are at the table. I guess stepping back a little bit further is, our tribe signed the Treaty of 1855, the Point Elliott Treaty. And from there, there were court cases that led up to the monumental Judge Bolt decision in 1974. We're just going to be recognizing that next week at Bolt 50. So it's been around for 50 years. Within that decision, we were deemed co-managers. And so at the state level, we are at that table. And so we do work with the state, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have a commission. And sadly enough, since 1979, when we were actually deemed co-managers, I've been working on the forefront of getting a actual state hatchery co-manager policy, an actual policy that the state and the tribes work together on. And like I said, sadly enough, it took 44 years just to actually get us on the, equal playing field that the state is on. They have done some unilateral policies that are not in the best interest of the tribes. And even just recently, as last week, we wrote them letters as far as requesting a government to government. And then, on the federal level, so, the co-stewardship is not as solid or does not have as much strength as the co-management that we've been deemed. That's actually the law. But we do have, we're actively involved, in our lands as far as, our forests. We do have what is our sacred site, Cherry Point, of which, there is a lot of, it's always under threat because it's one of the deepest ports in the Northwest. And so it's always under attack as far as refineries that are there. They were trying to put in a coal port. And so we actually had to, trust our federal trustees, the Army Corps of Engineers, to come in and stop that project. So it does take a lot of, in co-stewardship and in co-management, it takes a lot of relationship building because, we have to always at the forefront of educating. So it is a lot of burden on the tribes to continue to make sure that, the education is out there and making sure that our treaty rights are upheld. And it is definitely a very tiresome role that we play, but it's not jobs for us. It's who we are. So it's second nature that we are at the forefront when something comes our way to make sure that, I always look at it as, our ancestors fought really hard to make sure that they retained our way of life. And I feel like it is our duty and our responsibility to make sure that we uphold what our ancestors did, but also, not just, teach the future generations so that they can continue on the work that our ancestors did. And so like I said, it does take a lot of work and it does take a lot of coordination. One of the issues that we have is that, all of our tribes are so busy, not just with natural resource in the lands. There's so many things that come out at us like a fire hose. And so to actually, our tribes, when we stand strong together, coordinated, we're unstoppable, but it's actually a lot of work making sure that we coordinate in a fashion that we will be effective. And so that's definitely a challenge for us, but we will never stop. And so that's just something that has been passed down to us. And so it's something that we can never compromise on. So thank you.
Yeah, that is very powerful. Thank you so much, Lisa. Up next, Edward, if I could ask, if you could please share with us some of the co-management projects that you're working on, and what does this mean for your people and the key elements of this work?
Yeah, thank you, Don. So my work currently includes about 23 co-management or co-stewardship agreements presently in negotiation, depending on how you count them. We are simultaneously exploring opportunities with the National Park Service and with the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Mvskoke tribe and the park unit immediately adjacent to tribal lands, Big Cypress National Preserve, was one of a handful of park unit tribal nation pairs named by Director Sams in his memorandum in, I think, late 2022 as being authorized for co-management, not just co-stewardship. But also where I'm sitting right now, the Mvskoke Reserved Area is within the external borders of Everglades National Park, and the tribe is pursuing an agreement there, as well as in Big Cypress National Preserve, which was founded as a multi-use preserve, the first of its kind, whereby Interior recognized the tribe's continuing rights to use and occupancy in the preserve by statute. So to this day, the tribe maintains 15 traditional villages, medicine gathering spaces, ceremonial grounds, burial grounds within that park unit's borders. So in many respects, the tribe is already engaged in some degree of co-management there, but there are aspects we're seeking further involvement in. And broadly speaking, all the lands we're pursuing co-management or co-stewardship in, whether it's in one of the 3 national parks in southern Florida, or whether it's one of the national wildlife refuges in the Greater Everglades, at some point were homelands for the tribe until the end of the Seminole Wars in the mid-1800s, or in the case of Everglades National Park, until the eviction of tribal villages when the park was designated in the 1930s. So this is of great importance to the Mvskoke people, who are, broadly speaking, sandwiched between federal lands, rising sea levels, and water conveyance structures managed for the benefit of agricultural producers in the nearby urban area that stretches from Miami-Dade County up to Palm Beach County. So there's plants and animals of great importance that have moved elsewhere because of these ecosystem disruptions, and tribal cultural resources have been locked behind artificial borders. So there's really a very important opportunity to restore tribal connectivity to the landscape and to ensure that the traditional stewards of this land remain its stewards, in fact, today. This, to the tribe, is really rooted in the period of the Seminole Wars, which lasted almost 50 years, from around 1817 until 1858. And the Mvskoke and the Seminole tribe of Florida are still here in Florida because Mother Everglades provided a refuge for them when the Removal Act and the Second Seminole War were underway, and most of the Seminole and Mvskoke people were removed out to Oklahoma. The ones that weren't removed were able to take refuge on the traditional Treaty Islands. So as the tribe sees the landscape getting impacted, as the tribe sees continuing policy changes in some of these federal lands, the tribe is seeking to return the favor and trying to protect the Everglades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edward. That's incredible work that you're doing on multiple projects. Our next question is for Pat. If Pat, you can share your experience with us on Bears Ears project. Walk us through the process, the lessons learned, and advice you have for tribes considering a co-management project.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me fine? Great. Yeah, it's interesting to kind of overview in retrospect. The first thing, and I echo the sentiments of both Larry and Lisa, at its inherent and kind of core, co-management is really about the exercise and the extension of sovereignty. It is capturing that particular affectation of the political identity of tribes, and then utilizing it as a really palpable tool to kind of work in collaboration with the federal government. And so, one of the things that when I think about why the Bears Ears was successful is, one, we learned many lessons, and we looked at many different models that are existing. And I think the first and foremost, and we need to provide acknowledgement, is the Columbia Intertribal Fish Commission. Because of their existence and where they started, and which was very similar to the Bears Ears, with one distinction. They went from a small grassroots organization and now have upwards of 200 employees, annual budget that's north of $40 million. And in many ways, I think are an exemplary model of what this can look like, while they really utilize their own kind of traditional and cultural precepts to instruct the process in tandem with the highest level of science. And so that model is one that we kind of emulated. Now, I think it's noteworthy to mention, and this is one of the difficulties with co-management. If you're not operating out of a delineated tribal treaty right, it puts you in this corner where a host of other things have to be addressed. The reason I say that, and a bit of kind of background for those who may not be as well versed in this, is treaty obligations are really the responsibility of the federal government to exercise on behalf of the tribes. And so when you're in that position from a treaty right, it is quite stark if you don't have a treaty right. And in the case of the Bears Ears, we did not. So that kind of leads me to these other kinds of elements that you really have to explore. And that is, are there legal instructions? Are there particular kinds of things that can advance it from an agency level? And if there isn't, the tribes have to collectively then advocate to the respective agencies to use legal instruction, and then formulate a kind of a plan of action, be it, whether that's a memorandum of agreement or an MOU. And so I think, at this moment, what we're really kind of thinking about is, how can we get more consistency from the federal government? How can we have a further kind of explanation of the different iterations of co-management, collaborative management, shared management? I think at the highest level, right, it's co-management, sovereign to sovereign, shared decision-making, and shared assets and resources. But here is the challenging thing. In all of these, there is no budget. And so really what you're doing is confronting the agency, trying to create a dynamic in which there's an interface, in which really spells out the positive attributes of the co-management kind of model. But then, unless you've had some form of foundation or philanthropic funding, it really puts you in a pickle on how you advance this, because none of these agencies have budgeted for co-management, which means you are featuring their existing budget. And this would relate to other kinds of objectives and priorities they may have. And some of those priorities and objectives may be with other tribal nations. And so I think that is a huge elephant in the room. And the other portion of it is, while it is sovereign to sovereign, the co-management kind of dynamic really requires that you cultivate and nurture an external kind of arrangement where non-tribal groups are also supporting you. And so these may be other environmental and conservation groups, but it also means, in a very practical way, how you can intersect against foundations and philanthropy, because in the practical reality is they're going to provide the seed money so that you can advance it until you can have a formal agreement with the federal government. And so this is, something that Greg and I have kind of spoke long about, is we need to develop some liquidity so that it allow tribes to initiate new co-management projects without the pressure until they can get those MOUs and MOAs. So I'll kind of leave it at that. That was a lot for like 6 or 7 minutes.
Oh, that's really important, and it kind of calls in who is participating today, maybe listening in. The next question we have for Larry, and at the National Congress of American Indians is on really the front line of policy work and advocacy. What are some of the key policies and bodies of work on co-management that you are focused on this year? And how do you address the durability of this work through various administrations?
Yeah, and I think it was said before, it's advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And as you mentioned, NCAI is a policy advocacy organization that represents tribal nations. Our policy positions are developed with extensive input from tribal nations, and only positions that have widespread consensus throughout Indian country are adopted and advocated for by NCAI. And as with many areas of advocacy, NCAI's positions on co-management and co-stewardship have been developed over many years. The most recent comprehensive position on the matter came in 2020, which called on Congress to pass legislation directing federal agencies to include tribal nations in land management decisions at every level of government based on incorporation of tribal co-management principles and practices. That same resolution also called upon both Congress and the executive branch to enhance and recognize tribal legal authorities supporting tribal co-management, as well as to directly fund tribal land management on tribal, state, and federal lands. But in addition to the 2020 amendment that provides for broad support of co-management and co-stewardship, NCI has produced more than half a dozen resolutions on this topic in the last decade alone. Many of those resolutions call for support of specific types of agreements. For example, agreements focusing on protecting species that have been delisted from the Endangered Species Act, or in specific regions, for example, in certain parts of Alaska, where subsistence hunting and fishing is a way of life, and its protection is critical not only for cultural reasons, but for the very livelihood of the people who live there. In terms of more specific priorities, NCAI is advocating for right now, most of those efforts are focused on the Farm Bill, which is an enormous piece of legislation that touches on many topics related to land and agriculture. And the Farm Bill is typically reauthorized every 5 years. And outside of funding the federal government, getting the Farm Bill passed is a high priority for nearly every member of Congress. And within it, there are many different titles dealing with a range of different topics. And just to provide you with one example, Title 8, for instance, deals with forestry. Now, tribal nations have been engaged in management and stewardship of forest lands for thousands of years. And currently 313 federally recognized tribal nations continue to manage forests today in one way or another. But as we all know, there's room for improvement, which is why NCAI, as part of the Native Farm Bill Coalition, are advocating for the Farm Bill to authorize a pilot for tribal nations and the BIA to conduct cooperative discretionary forest restoration activities on U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands using existing regulations governing the management of Indian forests. An agreement of this type we believe would expand on current opportunities under the law, and again, provide tribal nations with more sovereign control over the lands that they traditionally utilized, and that remained invaluable to this very day. With respect to your second question about the durability of this work from administration to administration, I think there are a few things we should keep in mind. First, the authority for co-management, co-stewardship agreements is not guided solely by the will of the executive branch. The reality is there are statutes that have been passed authorizing and encouraging these types of agreements. Some of these statutes list tribal nations among other entities for cooperative agreements. There is also legislation such as the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act that specifically allows agencies to delegate their authority to tribal nations to manage certain programs or regulate certain activities. And I point that out just to indicate that there is authority to enter into these agreements regardless of who's in the White House. And actually, for some tribal nations, the authority is actually higher than statutes because a number of tribal nations have co-management and co-stewardship concepts directly in their treaties, which are laws that are supposed to be on par with the U.S. Constitution as part of the supreme law of the land. And while there is statutory authority and authority in treaties, I'll note that more can be done, obviously, in this area, which is why NCI is continuing to advocate for more clear direction from Congress and more authority given to agencies to enter into these types of agreements. The second point I want to make about durability is simply to note that when you're in a world of advocacy, especially with respect to tribal nations, you are constantly working to educate. And while it's true that changes in administrations come with changing priorities, changing personnel throughout the federal government, there's always a certain amount of stability that can help keep things moving forward for tribal nations. Agencies may change appointed leaders, but their staffers are often there for years or even entire careers. But there's and spending time educating those staff members is an important step in keeping this type of ongoing work moving forward. But beyond that, and you'll hear me say it frequently in different places that I travel, Indian country work is nonpartisan work, and tribal nations are all over the political spectrum, as are their tribal citizens. And the issues that impact tribal nations most, though, such as the protection of land, water, natural resources, and especially sacred sites, those are issues that have widespread agreement within Indian country because they are about what it means to be Native and about what it means to ensure our traditions and beliefs are carried into the future for generations to come. So no matter who's in office, there's always a path to walk to continue the work of strengthening tribal sovereignty. Sometimes it takes more effort than others, but Native people have been and continue to be resilient, and we will continue to work together to make sure that it's our visions for our own futures that will continue to carry the day.
Very powerful, Larry. Thank you so much. Let's take it to you, Lisa. If you could share with us the key Lummi Nation co-management project, and what are some of the key elements of this project, some of the hurdles you're encountering, and what support, if any, do you need for Lummi Nation projects?
Thank you. I know it's been said before, but we've been stewards of the land since time immemorial, and it's been stated that that salmon is as important as the air that we breathe. One of our sayings is when the tide is out, the table is set, and so it was very important that that our ancestors secured the rights to fish, hunt, and gather in our usual and accustomed areas during signing of that treaty. But it seems like ever since that treaty was signed, we've been fighting to make sure that they uphold those promises that were made. Isaac Stevens said that you will always have fish for your frying pans. Well, and ever since then, at that time, salmon weren't as important because the only way to preserve them was to pickle and barrel them. But it wasn't until like canning was invented that they actually became a commodity. And so once they became that commodity, our people were pushed out of the fisheries, even out of our fishery that we created. The reef net fishery was something that our ancestors, they created that, and what ended up happening is it was taken over by non-tribal fishermen. And so now, even since the Judge Bolt decision, that when we were awarded, we don't say we awarded, because people look at it in different ways. The signing of that treaty is where, our fishing rights were adjudicated, and that 50% of the resources were allocated to the tribes. And so, some of our people say, well, we had 100%, so we actually gave up 50%. They didn't give us anything. They're the ones that took half. But right now, the state that we are in, and with our salmon stocks, they're depleting. It's been depleted so much that we've really had to heavily rely on our hatcheries. And so we created a 10-year plan, that because what we were doing is we go up every year and kind of like divide up what's left, and we are basically writing the harvest to zero. But we decided, what, you focus on manifest. So instead of writing that harvest to zero, let's bring back our salmon. Let's put all of our efforts on bringing back our salmon through our hatcheries. And so we created a 10-year plan, and the goals were to get back to our 1985 levels of harvest for our fishermen. So in 2015, we literally had 9 South Fork Chinook salmon. Well, after that, we brought those numbers up to about 3,000 a few years ago. But, just as we were starting to celebrate that we can show that we can bring back our salmon, 2,500 of them died before they could reach the spawning grounds. And the problems that we're having is that we've had, a lot of years of habitat degradation, pollution, water issues, illegal water withdrawals out of our Mvskoke River. And so, we've been putting strong efforts on fixing our habitat. And so here we are, bringing our own salmon back, of which was promised to us, fixing our habitat, a problem we didn't create. And then we're put in state processes where we're having to compete against that funding, against stakeholders, to get the resources. And then on top of that, once we do get those resources, we have all these bureaucracies of, permitting and all of those things that really impact us getting back to salmon recovery. And so we've been working really diligently these last few years. We actually worked on an executive order for the President of the United States to put somebody in charge of our federal trustees to make sure that they're helping us, because instead of coming at us as trustees, they come at us as regulators. They limited us so much on our hatcheries and then also our harvest that it's like tying both of our hands behind our back. And so there should be concessions made for the tribes that are upholding the treaty obligation to ourselves. So what we need is just, and also the resources. So we fought really hard last year on that IRA funding, the Inflation Reduction Act funding, to put it out there that the tribes need the resources directed straight to them through our self-governance, compacts and 638 contracts, because we've got so much burden put on us, and then we've got to compete for these grants. So it was a monumental thing, because NOAA was going to roll out this money without consultation or consideration of the tribes, and just putting us in those processes where we not only have to compete against each other, but we have to compete against NGOs and stakeholders when it's our treaty right and it's their privilege. And so we actually turned that paradigm to get them thinking that whenever they can get that money directed straight to tribes and bypass these processes and get the money to us so that we can just get the work done. And so those are the things that we're struggling with right now is we have to do a big overhaul on our hatcheries. Our hatcheries are over 50 years old. We have water that's an issue right now. And so we're working on the water adjudication for the Mvskoke River, so to make sure that our salmon do have the water. And so as you can see, and now, I'll be going back to DC to talk about, because our hatcheries are held to a higher standard than wastewater treatment plants. And we have to go through the same permitting that the developers do that degrade the habitat. We have to go through the same permitting to fix the habitat. And so it is putting a disproportionate burden undue burden on the tribes. And so these are some of the things that we've got to highlight. We've got to get out of being down here and get back up to the supreme law of the land. And that's why we were going for this executive order, because that's where our treaty rights belong, not down here in processes that diminish and water down our treaty rights. So, it is a lot of work. It's something that it's an around the clock job, always outreach, always trying to stay on top of things, always trying to advocate for the funding and advocate for our employees that are on the front lines doing the hard work. So yeah, that's what we're up against. Thank you.
Well, absolutely massive hurdles. And you have a lot of people that are behind you here in this webinar. Really powerful points. I want to ask the same question to Edward. Similar question. What are some of the hurdles that you are encountering with your co-management projects, multiple projects, and what support do you need to make these projects a reality? And for listeners out there who may not be directly connected to tribal work, how does your project align with the 30 by 30 initiative and the greater conservation movement?
Thanks, Don. How much time do I have?
About 5 to 7 minutes.
All righty. So first of all, I really want to give a shout out to the Pacific Northwestern tribes like the Lummi Nation. The work y'all are doing to improve ecosystem connectivity and defend tribal rights on your corner of Turtle Island is an inspiration to us even here on the deepest corner of the Deep South. So it is interesting, though, that Pat brought up treaty rights and Lisa focused on those Stevens treaty rights, because Mvskoke, my client, is not a treaty tribe. The tribe is proudly unconquered, maintains that it has never signed a treaty with the United States, and only received its federal recognition after a trip to Cuba in 1959, wherein the Castro regime first recognized the Mvskoke as a sovereign years before the United States built that government-to-government relationship in 1962. So in practice, whether we're talking about co-stewardship or co-management with the Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service or the Forest Service, the process for us is roughly the same. To reach an agreement requires working all the way up and down the vertical chain of an agency to find the consensus that the agency's solicitors, the political leadership in DC, the local park superintendents or refuge managers, and key local staff are comfortable with. If there's an approach that diverges from past standard operating policy, which pretty much any co-management or co-stewardship agreement will, then there will likely need to be engagement direct from DC to chart that policy course forwards. So having allies that can further engagement by political leadership, like the National Parks Conservation Association, shout out to the NPCA people I saw on this call who are helping us right now, can only help. But despite the best intentions of agency staff and leadership and tribal staff and leadership, the negotiation process will be limited by the extant authorities. So even where there may be existing authority to co-manage, it may not be the authority to co-manage the same element of that federal land unit that the tribe is interested in being involved in. So where there's not co-management authority, there may be some good general authority already on the books for the agency to engage in that kind of delegation or burden sharing with the tribe. But sometimes the legal architecture just doesn't exist to facilitate co-management or co-stewardship of particular elements of particular concern to a tribe. So we can find creative alternative sources of authority, or we can simply concede to lesser achievements, or we can seek legislative fixes where that authority doesn't already exist. And this is particularly salient when we're talking about legislative walls already extant, blocking substantial tribal stewardship, like the Wilderness Act, for example, which provides for the protection of areas where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and does not remain, which retain the primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation. These kind of laws are innately anti-Indigenous, conceived of in an early period of Park Service history defined by the eviction of Native peoples from traditional lands. During the founding of Yellowstone, there were 300 Shoshone who were killed in a single day of violent mass evictions. In the 1930s, literally like right behind me, Mvskoke were evicted from Everglades National Park, several traditional villages, as well as a designated reservation of 99,000 acres. But as the late Native advocate John Trudell said, we are all shapes and forms of the earth. So to seek any part of the land which has not been shaped by its traditional stewards is to engage in a intentional process of forgetfulness and erasure. And sometimes we're grappling with that kind of mentality when we're, working with federal land managers who have been raised in that system. I always love pointing people in the direction of Braiding Sweetgrass, though, that Robin Kimmerer book from like 2013, because I think what it establishes is something that we're always grappling with when we're seeking to create co-management or co-stewardship relations, which sometimes a landscape isn't complete, it isn't protected, it isn't stewarded unless Indigenous people are on that landscape. Kimmerer gives as a specific example sweetgrass gathering places, which when regularly gathered from, when tended by people, they're adapted to that. They thrive on that. And when left alone without humans as part of that ecosystem, then those same sweetgrass patches are not as healthy. And I think we can find parallel examples across Turtle Island. Turning to 30 by 30. I forgot how to say this. So the 30 by 30 initiative has a positive intention. And metrics like those which give the name to the initiative are a great way to set measurable goals. But they can also lead to callous bureaucratic outcomes. There are Western assumptions underlying the 30 by 30 initiative that fail to acknowledge the role of Indigenous peoples as land stewards. If you account for Indigenous community conserved areas, and I'm pretty sure there's a really great Nature Conservancy study that came out in the last few years on this, the vast majority of Indigenous people's lands remain in good ecosystem condition, like over 90%. So this accounts for more than 39% of the Earth's most ecologically intact lands. So if you're accounting for Indigenous community conserved areas, we reached 30 by 30 in like 30 BC. So the entire idea of pursuing 30% conservation, that is ignoring Indigenous people. So, there is brewing in many places, and there's a couple of journalists and media outlets covering this domestically and abroad. There is a conflict between Indigenous people already protecting certain lands and then those trying to protect those lands from their historic protectors. Rather than looking for a 30% statistic, the Mvskoke tribe would prefer to assess conservation based upon the restoration of connectivity in the ecosystem, connectivity of wildlife corridors, connectivity of water flows, but also connectivity of people to their traditional lands. So Indigenous people are the model, should be the model for the 30 by 30 initiative, but it's best to maybe rethink the role of Indigenous people in providing that example, creating the template by which Western agencies should be following to do their piece of conservation. I'd really encourage y'all to also check out Preservation Pause. It's an organization that's being sponsored by my alma mater, the University of Arizona Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. And they're focusing exactly on this and working with the UN Special Rapporteur to see where there's preservation that is in conflict with Indigenous rights. So that's a lot of word vomit, but hopefully that addressed all of your questions, Don. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely powerful. And we're all listening to the connectivity connection that you've made for us. Landscape, connectivity, protection, these are powerful words. Next question is for you, Pat, and I want to thank you also for answering so many of these great Q&A questions, and invite other panelists when you're not speaking to answer as well. But for Pat, can you help us kind of put a bow on some of these elements? What do you see are the key elements of co-management and co-stewardship successfully being implemented to support tribal goals, the administration's goals, and great conservation bodies of work within for the future, next 10 to 20 years, let's say?
Damn, Don, didn't give me an easy one. I want to kind of reflect, because this is in relation to my answer, but Larry's kind of last point about self-determination and really 638 contracting is an incredible, profound opportunity. However, it is one that is vastly underutilized within the federal apparatus. I'm pretty long in the tooth, so I actually worked on the 1993 amendments when I was on the Hill about this. And what we've come to at this point is many federal agencies don't want to consider 638. And just to explain for those people who are out there, these are the services that are provided say on a federal function, and let's use the example of the Bison Range, where those FTEs and the monies to support the overhead of the FTE as well as the administration are then placed in the hands of the tribe. For those of us that know, in order to do this, you need to be a qualified 638 tribe, which means basically you have the appropriate infrastructure and capacity to carry this out. Now, I think this is a wonderful kind of segue that we should be placing more emphasis and, dare I say, more pressure that we need to open this up more, because if tribes were allowed to do this, we would see exponentially more co-management projects, because there would be a transfer internally of these resources. Now, so to kind of further advance, what do we need as we go into the further decades? Several things need to happen. One, I think we need, especially the three departments that are most engaged with co-management, and let me caveat, there are more than three departments, but there are three major ones: Department of Interior, USDA, and then Commerce via NOAA. Those three have probably the lion's share of co-management projects going on. So if there was a secretarial order that instructed all agencies on both the kind of definition of co-management, how it could be funded, but also encouraging agencies to look at the ability to do co-management, I think that would greatly fortify all of our existing efforts. The problem with that is there's nary any kind of real resources for that. So we're going to have to address this in some way in order to provide something for the tribes, again, to have the liquidity to start these projects. To that, I think the other thing that we could look at as a potential strategy is if this instruction came from a central kind of voice from the White House, I'm thinking CEQ to all of the germane departments, and then attaching resources to this. But as we look at these bigger things like Justice 40 and the endeavors that we're doing within the Beautiful Coalition, and for transparency, I'm one of the steering members of that. Indian country can play such a pivotal role. The goals of Justice 30 is to save 30% of public waters and public lands by 2030. Public lands are 600 million acres if you include Alaska Natives. Tribes represent 100 million acres of that. So by concentrating the work within Indian country, you almost tack to success immediately if you place an emphasis on Indian country. The other portion about it, and what I've told other people about the Bears Ears, but any co-management project, is tribes have been here from time immemorial. They are the proven stewards. They are the proven kinds of custodians of these lands. One need not worry where a tribe's going, as opposed to some conservation group. And so you have a partner that brings inherent knowledge that runs in tandem with traditional and native principles and runs that with science. It's a remarkable dynamic that we are really kind of offering to the federal government. And so I think much of the narrative is there. That said, we have gotten to the point where the success of co-management is quickly approaching its own cul-de-sac, and that cul-de-sac is limited by the amount of kind of resources that we need to have in a very defined way. And I say that because, like any kind of topic or project, you have ones that are more charismatic than others. The Bears Ears is this incredibly profound area that just takes everyone's breath away, but not every project is going to look like that. And so now you start cannibalizing by those ones that really kind of create an appeal to the public. And so in order to kind of create a balance and equilibrium, we need to have resources so that smaller projects, ones that are lesser known, have an equal and kind of equitable ability for success on these. And I think that we need, again, a coordination, hopefully from CEQ or the White House, and then from the secretarial level, that would both kind of define co-management as well as attach resources to it. And I think that is really the endeavor that all of us should be kind of looking at for the next decade.
Fantastic, Pat, as usual. I talked a lot about resources, and so I'd like to turn the attention to Greg Maston, from the NCAI Foundation, who can really help us wrap up this conversation. Turn it to you, Greg.
Thank you, Dawn. And I just want to extend a huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insights today. So thank you to Larry and to Pat and Lisa and Edward. And I think it's been an amazing discussion. We heard so many perspectives today, from the policy side to what it looks like on the ground to just the commitment to this body of work that Native people and the tribes hold as a sacred trust. And I like what you just said, Pat, that you have a partner here who inherently is committed and devoted to this body of work. And so there's just so much that I think we can still continue to explore, to look at where there's alignment with the 30 by 30. And I've heard many tribal leaders share what Edward was talking about, that the 30 by 30 is great, but some tribes have even larger goals than that. So I think there's a lot that we want to still continue to discuss and explore and find out where we can really truly align our efforts together. So Thank you, Larry, for kind of level setting for us on tribal sovereignty, and obviously for the work that NCAI has done over these years, especially in the policy realm. And really, as you were discussing, you know, the work that you've done, that really set a tone for this whole discussion we're having on co-management and co-stewardship. So the resolutions that NCAA approved and passed and advocated for really has kind of opened up this, you know, this body of work. And thank you, Lisa, and to the Lummi Nation for the work that you're doing in protecting the waterways and the salmon restoration. And I love what you said, Lisa. You said, we will never stop. And I think that is a key message that everybody needs to take away with them today, is that Native peoples, we will never stop. We have always been here. We're here now. We'll continue to be here. And so thank you, Lisa, for sharing your insights. And Edward, I think it's just incredible that you have 23 agreements in process. I think that is just amazing. So definitely let us know how we can continue to support you. And I wrote down lots of notes as you were speaking. And I think it's a really important point you brought up about 90% of the indigenous lands are intact. They are being managed correctly. So there's definitely a lot that I think the conservation movement can really learn from partnering with tribes. And Pat, as always, as Don said, you know, just the way you're able to pull it all together. Thank you so much for sharing with us kind of what you learned through that process with Bears Ears, and how we do need to open it up more and coordinate more. And as you said, most importantly, too, the funding that's needed. I know you saw that firsthand. You had this great work, and then you're out there scrambling, trying to get funds, you know, just to see the work continue. So that is an important part. And so two final thoughts. I think I'm really grateful for this partnership today. It's kind of a first step of the NCAI Foundation to partner with the America the Beautiful for All Coalition. But I just saw that there was so much alignment and good work happening from both organizations. And I really want us to understand each other better and learn how we can work together. And just to kind of get this on your radar, we are going to be doing another webinar the third week of February, specifically on the NCAI Foundation. So if you want to learn more about that, it'll be myself and Larry Wright and President Macaro, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into how the NCAI Foundation will continue to work with and support tribes, and how we'll work with other national organizations in doing this work. And just finally for today, just really encouraged and motivated and inspired by what I heard. And I hope that everybody that listened, you took something away from it today. And I hope that you have a better understanding of how tribes are doing this work already in protecting the water, protecting our wildlife, protecting our habitat. And there's just so many other examples we could highlight that's happening all across America. So and I want to close off by, I was having a great conversation with one of the other members of the coalition, Jerry Otero, and he just said something that's just stuck with me for ever since then, and I want to give him credit. And he said, the future is now. The future is now. So what we do now, how we advocate now, how we come together now, this is going to set the pace for what our children will inherit in the future. And I do think about that. I think about 50 years from now, you know, what species are going to be left? What waterways are still going to be flowing? What lands are still going to be left in harmony and in balance? And so there is a lot of time-tested, time-honored knowledge that Native people have held. And I truly believe that as this world moves forward, it needs that time-tested knowledge that Native people hold. So thank you all for your time today. And I wish you a great day and peace in your lives. So thank you very much.
Go.